This is the conversation between me and Aonghus McGovern. Aonghus is a PhD at Trinity College and works as a staff engineer for one of the biggest tech companies in Ireland. On this episode, they're going to give us their insight and opinions about safer and ethical AI, where we could explore a variety of topics on this episode. It was very interesting for me and very insightful. I hope it's going to be insightful for you as well. This is the Ways of Working podcast. Please leave a like, subscribe, and let's go to the episode. We can start now. So, thank you for accepting the invite. So, can you tell me a little bit about who are you and talk a bit about your background and how you can evolve in the field of ethical and responsible AI?
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks so much for having me. I've been working in the area for AI, I would say about 12, 13 years now. God, I'm like showing my age a little
Okay.
bit. So I started in 2011 when I did a PhD in personalized web services. I was specifically looking at services that handled unstructured content. So, in an application like that, one of the first things you need to do is to create or convert the unstructured representation into some structured form so that a machine can work with it. But there's a lot of different options for what structured representation you can choose. And the one that you choose should depend on the type of personalization you're trying to provide.
Mm.
For example, if I want to personalize news for you, say, a good thing to look at would be things like the people, the organizations, and the places that you're interested in, because news articles tend to be descriptions of those kinds of things. If I know that, say, you're into tech companies, I know I can recommend you tech related news. Or if you're into political figures, I can recommend you political news and so on. But if you think about content like, say, film or music or books, it's not really like that. It's more conceptual, right? Are you into rock music or romance books or action films or whatever it is? It's more thematic. At the time, there were a set of guidelines for how you should make the choice of structured representation based on the kind of personalization you wanted to provide. So my thesis essentially was a collection of those guidelines. I was using a lot of natural language processing to figure out how to convert whatever unstructured representation we were working with into the relevant structured representation. So I did that until around 2017. Then I moved into Accenture, where I worked as a data scientist. And my remit there was a lot more broad, where the group I worked with, we weren't part of the consultancy. We were an internal facing group that worked with Accenture's own business departments. And that could be anybody like marketing, sales, legal, anybody who had a problem that they felt could be solved by the use of AI. Like one application we built was for the legal department, where they wanted to have a search engine over all of Accenture's legal documents. And there were two kinds of search they were looking for. One is a pretty straightforward kind that's just called full text, where they just want to find a document that has a certain word in it. That might be a client's name or a technology or whatever it is. The next form, it was a bit more complicated, where they were looking for a search over what were called clauses. A clause in a legal document lays out some obligation that a person has. Like a common one would be liability, where it says if one of the parties in the contract doesn't meet their obligations, this is what's going to happen. Another important one is what's called force majeure. And that's where some completely unpredictable event occurs. It could be a flood or an earthquake, something that prevents one of the parties from meeting their obligations. And because that's not their fault, they should get some relief, right? They should maybe get an extension or whatever it is, just something that helps them deal with this situation. And trying to find those is a lot more complicated because it's not the same language that's used document to document. It's not the same word each time or the same collections of words. It can be different. So we had to have an approach there where we were looking at general language patterns that are used to refer to certain clause types. And we were able to use those language patterns to flag documents. And it was through this work in Accenture that I eventually got into the area of responsible AI. One application that we worked on was with HR, and they were trying to create an application that would automatically process a candidate's CV and identify the 10 most relevant job descriptions for that person. And we wanted to build an AI application to do this. But one thing we were particularly concerned about was the possible impact of gender bias in hiring. At that time, Amazon had tried to build something very similar to what we were
Yeah,
trying to build.
I
And they
remember that
eventually,
one.
you heard that one. It's quite a well known one. And like, I
Yeah.
think one of the earliest examples, I
Mm,
think, of a large company running into a substantial bias issue
mm,
in something that they were building, or one prominent examples. And we were keen to avoid a similar kind of situation.
mm-hmm,
So, as part of that work, we were looking at trying to identify patterns in language that might encode gender bias and try to mitigate as much as possible the effects of those. And that's complicated for a couple of reasons. One is just building the actual processing pipeline itself,
mm-hmm,
but the other part is understanding how this bias can creep in. And what we found is there's two broad ways. One is through a fact that women are a bit more likely than men to self-identify in their CVs. You
mm,
might see a woman say, "I participated in Women in STEM or Women in Tech event," or some other event like that that's specifically focused on trying to increase women's representation in the tech community.
mm-hmm,
You'll never see that with a man, really. There's no like
mm.
men in tech or anything like that. We're already pretty represented there. Um, so that's a tricky part, right? Where that kind of self-identification happens a bit more frequently, or we saw that it would happen a bit more frequently. But another part of it is there are some differences in how women and men describe their own experience, right? Where
Mhm,
women will often tend to emphasize collaborative terms like team building and working with other people and so on. Whereas men would often try to emphasize stronger terms like leading or driving or all of
mm,
this kind of thing. So you could have a man and a woman describing the same experience, where a woman would say that she was an important member of a team, where a man would try to make out that the whole thing would have fallen apart if it wasn't for him, even if it's the same thing. Um, and these kinds of bias, they affect differently.
mm,
And it also like it impacts the effectiveness of the or effectiveness of the approach, in the sense that accuracy in that case could just mean reproducing old hiring decisions that are inherently encoding some bias in
mm,
there.
mm,
So you're trying to think about your solution not just in terms of is it able to reproduce patterns in this data that you have, but actually what patterns do you want to reproduce and what
yeah,
patterns do you not want to reproduce?
mm,
And it was after that that I started to get more in field. I've started now writing regularly about that, and I'm trying to like it's become more and more a part of my role, I think. And I'd say yeah, that's ultimately how I got into it.
all right, that's cool. Yeah, that's processing CV is a interesting thing, right? Because from my perspective, for example, on the tech side, when you see like a lot of like projects using natural language processors to process a CV, it's pure technical expertise rather than like gender or and other things. But then, and
Mm,
I see like I always like being when I saw that thing on Amazon, I was like, what? Oh my god, why they include gender on like on the processing of the data? You know,
mm,
because that doesn't in my head it's like it doesn't matter, you know, this is something that
right.
doesn't matter. But then I saw a case, I think was I don't remember, I'm not gonna call out the company because I don't know if it's correct company that does that,
Sure.
but there is some things about personality trait as well that they prefer on
Mm,
certain employees, and then this can
mhm,
go around like the gender like not that it's specific for gender but specific to individuals, but then you can
mm,
find more in a certain groups than in the other, and then
right.
this can like actually, so if you are like fit in another group but you have specific traits that actually could put you like into the group that's unfavorable, you're not going to
Mm,
be selected. So yeah, so how do you see, for example, for the area that's not tech related, right? So because I believe in tech spaces, it's pure technical. So like they they're only gonna judge you by your technical expertise. I don't know
Mhm.
if there is any company nowadays that does
Mhm.
gender identification or personality on like
Right.
tech field. But how do you
Mhm.
see like on this part, how you feel like the company should be treating a certain like a certain position, let's say like an accountant, for example? Do
Mhm.
you believe that AI should be leave out of this? It be more like uh, human decision, or you feel like AI
Right.
actually can come in and help to employers to take a better decision over these type of employees?
It's a great question, and I think it cuts to the core of the debate that's happening right now in AI in general, which
Yeah.
is what actually is the right role for this technology to play in any
Mm-hmm.
decision making process, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whether it's hiring or in medicine or in any kind of business that we might want to put it into. And I think the way I would think about it is anything that requires a substantial level of human to human understanding is better left to humans, right?
Mm-hmm.
And like when I think about this and I'm trying to extend it in the field, right? I think about the example of a calculator, right? And the accountancy example, it's a good one for this, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's it's appropriate to have an accountant use a calculator because you don't want a person to do math. It's a waste of their time, right? You
Yeah.
just have the calculator do it,
Mm-hmm.
and then the person is freed up to work on more important stuff that the calculator can't do, right? Finding saving in the budget, or maybe their job is to identify fraud or whatever it is. And that's a good relationship between a human and a machine.
Mm-hmm.
And when I think about data science or AI in general, I think it's about trying to find similar situations
Mm-hmm.
where you've got a piece of processing that is better left to a machine so that a person can be freed up to work on things that are better left to humans. So there's a concept in AI called human that describes this idea where we have an AI decision process, but there's human input at important parts so that, say, humans might decide which kinds of CVs that an AI might look at. Or we might say that if we have a recruiting process, there might be five different stages. The first one is where a recruiter reviews a CV that comes in. Then maybe the second one would be someone else signs off on that. At that point, then we might say an AI goes in to look out to see whether it has the specific right technical skills or if they've been in the area for long enough. And then there's subsequent stages where the person gets interviewed, or you might
Mm-hmm.
want to implement it differently.
I see.
But the point for me is not so much whether AI should be integrated into various fields. I think it probably will help in any field that has a large amount of data processing needs.
Mm-hmm.
It's a question of have we properly articulated what we're going to use it for? And can we justify that? And do we have proper human oversight of the AI's decision making?
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, that's well put in. So yeah, and so today, what do you believe? What do you think about the current state of ethics into AI projects? Because I don't know if you saw it, but like Microsoft, they take off all the ethical AI team from the research labs, and I don't know if other companies are doing that. But what do you think is happening right now on this field? And how do you think like big companies are treating ethics like ethics into the AI ecosystem?
Yeah, I mean, I think with the story with Microsoft, my understanding there is that it was a bit more of a restructuring
Oh, okay.
situation. I
Yeah.
think they do have, like,
Mm-hmm.
actually with Accenture, one thing I worked on a bit was with folks in their ethics division there.
All
They
right.
do have a strong ethics group there, and I think it is something that they look at a lot. And like, I think it varies, right, company to company. It's hard to know what happens internally within organizations, but the people who are
Mm-hmm.
driving ethics or driving AI forward, the biggest users of it, my broad sense, I think, is that they do care about it, right?
Mm-hmm.
That even if you think about it on a basic human level, no person wants to make something that harms another person, right? Or
Yeah,
very few
it's true.
people want to do that, right? So there's
Yeah.
a base level where very few people want to do that. There's a base level where you can acknowledge that a person at least wants not to harm people,
Mm-hmm.
right? And really, where I think the biggest issue is that the general public at the moment doesn't have a language to tell people, whether that's regulators or companies, what they want.
Mm.
So when I think about AI and safety, one industry I like to think about is automobiles, right? Because if you think about when they were first made, people them, right? There was a sense like, oh, we couldn't possibly live at those speeds. They're going to kill us. There's no way these things are going to coexist peacefully with people. I remember reading a court ruling from a US court. I think it was like the late 1800s or the early 1900s, something like that. And the judge was saying cars should be classified in the same category as dangerous animals, right?
Mm.
Wild beasts, because of their threat to
It's true.
humans, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, if you fast forward now, they're everywhere and they're still extremely dangerous, right? I
Yeah.
don't think we often think about that, but they're really, really dangerous. But we live quite harmoniously with them. Like, you don't think twice about getting into a car, it's not really an issue. Um, and I think there's a lot for AI to learn from that as an industry. So we think about, like, if you were going to go and buy a car, right? You would have some criteria about what you wanted. You might say, I want good gas mileage, or I want a hybrid, or I want a car with a good safety rating, or whatever it is, right? And our ability to articulate those preferences pushes car manufacturers, right? Like, if you look at, say, now the big focus is on electric vehicles,
Hmm.
and that came about through user expressed preference, right? Where more and more people are looking for that now, and car manufacturers are responding to that requirement, that need that people are expressing. But if we think about AI, right, there's no such language, right? You can't really shop around for AI products, not as an average consumer. Like, as a person in tech, you would have a better sense for what to be concerned about, right? The way that data is managed and maintained, the kind of inferences that AI is making, and so on. So it is technically possible to shop that way, but the average person can't do that. And honestly, I think that's where the bigger gap is at the moment, right? Like, I think a lot of companies are doing a lot to try and make sure that they're building responsibly, that they're looking at what consumers' needs are, and that they're trying to protect people. And I think regulators are doing a lot. I think the EU is a bit further ahead, but the US now is really looking at this, and like China has come out with a framework, and a lot of regulators are looking really hard at this. I don't think there's any shortage of effort and concern on either the business or regulation side. I think it's that until consumers are empowered to push people to say what they want, then it's always going to be a kind of catch up situation where we'll only react to like really serious breaches, or some big story will come out about a particularly bad example, and then people will react to that. So, like, honestly, when I think about ethics, I think more about that part, right? I think that's where the big gap is
Hmm.
at the moment.
Yeah, I think like people they love to see, at least like on the entrepreneurship side, people wants to put AI on everything and say that they have AI.
Mm,
I think
yeah.
the main problem is like that the companies have to realize that actually AI is an added value to what you're offering to people, and it don't need to be in your
Mm.
face all the time. It just need to be
Right.
implemented responsibly, and people will love the value that you're adding into your project, right? And
Yeah.
and talking about this, like to add AI on companies and everything, do you feel that the main challenge is not even to implement the AI itself, but actually implement this in a way that you can value the a more ethical implementation, or something
Mhm.
you can implement with a framework that you can actually uh, test it out and see if there is any failure, or you can like there is any fail safe that you can allow us to implement AI safer into these companies.
Mhm. Yeah, it's a great question. And like, in my experience, right, if I think about projects that I've worked on, building the AI model itself, it's not a trivial exercise. Obviously, it's difficult to get yourself to the accuracy that you want, but it's not the hardest part, right? Like,
Mm,
the most difficult part is actually figure out, how do you take the model that you've built and then integrate it into people's lives, right? So the group I work with, like I said, in Accenture, we looked at, or we worked with a lot of different business groups, and we were trying to build models for their specific problems. They all would have pre-existing business processes there that would need to change
Mm,
around the model that was being built. And figuring out how that works is actually really difficult, right? Because you first of all want to understand like what outcomes are you trying to drive?
yeah.
What decisions do you want people to make off the back of what your model is doing? And is it actually representing information in a way that's going to be helpful? And there's like two big things that we looked at there, which is interpretability and actionability, right? So interpretability, do I understand what the model is saying? And then two, actionability, can I do something meaningful off the back of that? Like if you think about one example, a lot of models that we worked with, they would make predictions about certain kinds of outcomes, and they would use information that people couldn't change, right? So in a hypothetical, if you're saying to somebody like, you've got a good chance of closing this business opportunity with this client, right? You could increase the probability if you change their industry from pharmaceutical to engineering, say, right? You can't do that, right? You
Mm,
can't physically change the industry, so that information is not actually actionable. So you're in a situation where you can interpret, but you can't action on it, right?
mm,
Now that's a fundamental issue, I think, in AI, and it relates into the ethics point, I think, because um, a lot of what you would see, or what I would see in terms of tooling or recommendations for the implementation of response is tech focused, right? So there's tons of libraries out there to do all kinds of really cool things to help you understand why a model works the way it does. They'll create a great graphical interface for it. They can show you how things would happen in certain scenarios. If the data was slightly different, it's all really brilliant, but it doesn't get at the more difficult part of understanding why people are actually interacting with your solution in the first place and what is its role supposed to be in their lives. And again, it goes back to what I was saying before about needing a language for consumers to express their preferences, because we need to be able to understand not just what tasks people want to do, right? Whether that's, buying something or watching a movie or whatever it is, but we also need to understand like what role people want AI to have in their lives. And it's not the same answer for every person, right? So different people who go to use, say, Netflix or Amazon will have different comfort levels in the kinds of inferences they'll want an AI to make. Right? Some people will let it do whatever it wants and they'll be happy with that. Other people will want some kind of inferences, but not other ones. And that, or what's the way to say it, like that person to person understanding of the consumer, I think
mm,
is it's a general issue in AI, and it's magnified in
mm.
the ethics debate. Because again, you can't really know how to build responsibly for a person if you don't know what responsibility means to them.
Yeah, it's true. I can relate it to that because actually, I for me it's like when I start working with machine learning models was back in IBM, but then one day I decided to make my own one, and I created one that I could tell based on the user inference like how what be the odds of this person to migrate. So the idea to
Mm,
migrate to any country of Europe, and you get the percentage. So the idea was to create a path for this person, and because I'm Brazilian, right? So yeah, I was
mm,
working with some friends and trying to figure out what it was, these percentages, and then I created the model and was all happy. I was like, oh yeah, I made it, but what am I gonna do with this now? I didn't have
right.
any idea what to do with it. And then
Mm,
what I decided to do was to create an app. I created a very simple app that people could get in, check it out, like their percentage to move, and uh,
mm,
for me it works very well because I could extract the a lot of personal preferences. I could put a lot more
mm,
general thing because I didn't want it to capture like a lot of like sensitive data, and because it was a very simple app, I have to implement a more security over that thing. But that was what
sure.
was interesting, like to see how it play out. But then, as you say, like understand. when you have the model, like what you're gonna do with that and how you're gonna do with that.
Mm.
And then on the other end, when something that is said as something that I've been researching for is like how do you create the right persona for that person that's visiting your application? How you build a model
Mm.
or different models that it can uh, reflect an actual good experience for that user. Because the problem is it's more like, oh, it's very nowadays very easy to understand and predict like what they're going to consume on a website. Like on
Mm.
Amazon, they know what your preference to consume, but then the
Mm.
point is more like, is this going to provide a good experience for the user, and how are you going to make this work?
Mhm.
And that's for me, it's been very hard to understand nowadays because I've been studying a lot of this.
Yeah, it's a difficult question, and I read a book a while ago. It's called Technically Wrong,
Oh yeah.
where the author talks about how the dynamics of some development teams can allow bias to creep in, even if
Mm,
it's unintentional. And one thing that she talks about, I think it's that book where she talks about the problem with personas, or one of the problems with sometimes how teams would do them, where you would have, say, laid out a particular kind of person, so like a CEO or excuse me, or a manager, and they would give them a name and they give them a picture. And what she was talking about is they would actually tend to encode stereotypes into that kind of language, right? So the
mm,
CEOs are almost always white men, and the lower level workers were then where you tended to find people who weren't just white and men and so on. So the personas as they were defined were actually more like stereotypes,
mm,
and once those are defined, that starts to influence how you're designing your application, right? Because you think you've written that a CEO is this white guy, and then you design on that basis.
mm,
So like even the idea of personas themselves is tricky, right? Where if you define a single kind of person as a single kind of role, then it's a risk, right?
mm,
Because you can imagine, like particularly, I think we're seeing as the world becomes more interconnected, there's all manner of ways to do the same kind of role, right?
mm,
There probably isn't a typical, like there isn't a typical parent, there isn't a typical programmer, there isn't a typical accountant. All manner of people do these kinds of jobs. So when you're talking about a persona of an accountant, like what is that actually?
yeah.
It's a very tricky thing to determine effectively.
It's true. It's true. Yeah. And yeah. So today, so you talk a little bit about like regulations on Europe, and
Mm.
how do you think the stage that they are right now? Because I remember when I first read the first proposals, I was kind of like very skeptical about it. The way that the EU want to enforce like some sort of like a ways for a company to audit or provide tools for the EU to audit their own model, or how they train the model,
Mm.
and what do you think the stage right now? Are you following what's going on there in Europe?
Yeah, I mean, lightly, I wouldn't claim to be an expert in the regulation at all, but it obviously has gotten a lot tighter in terms of applicate or AI applications specifically. They are enforcing strict requirements there. I think so. Somebody said to me a while ago, there was like regulation is often written to be as broad as possible so that we can figure out what the specifics look like, right? So
Hmm.
whether that's by companies bringing challenges in court or regulators just looking at how legislation actually applies to how the industry is practiced. So the initial regulation I think that the EU has come out with as written, I think, or my sense of it is that it's meant to, first of all, try and get a handle on some of the most serious pressing harms quickly, like
Hmm.
things that are like really existentially a problem, and just try to get some sort of bounds on those. But then more generally to just start laying out, just putting a flag down, essentially saying like, look, this is the broad thing we're concerned about, but you'll need to figure out how to actually implement that.
Hmm.
And like I think the fact that the EU is taking a strong line on that is gradually pushing other jurisdictions to do the same, right? Like I think my sense is that there's at least a perception in the US from people who are concerned about regulation that the EU is at least pushing into this area and trying to just see what's going to happen there. So I think like how this regulation is actually going to work, it's very early to tell, right?
Mm,
I can imagine various challenges starting to come in from companies. And like one thing people have raised as a potential issue is how this is going to affect the open source community, because,
yeah.
or even smaller companies, right? Because larger companies have well established. They've got groups who specifically look at this regulation, who track it as it's being developed, who are already up to date, largely up to date on it before it even comes out, and can then start distributing information out through their own organizations. Smaller companies or individual developers don't have those kinds of resources. So things like you mentioned, the auditing capability, that's going to be very difficult for an individual open source developer. And you can't have regulation that massively constricts open source, because obviously open source really drives the AI community in a substantial way.
Yeah.
So it just has to continue to flourish the way that it has. And I don't know how that's going to look, right? If there's going to be exceptions given to, say, individual developers or smaller companies, or what that's going to look like. So, like broadly, I'm happy that the EU is trying here to define things that are very difficult and to pin down an industry that is moving so fast. In terms of what that's actually going to look like for development, I think it's still too early to say.
That's true. Yeah, I think like other thing you wanted at least brought into society to discuss that, and it's important to understand because once for example people have your data and they train this in a model and you're not gonna have a say in it, it's very tricky situation. I
Mm-hmm.
don't remember if I don't remember the name of the company right now, but a few years ago a company that just scrapped photos of everyone over the internet
Mm-hmm.
and they train it and they're giving up to FBI to other um like institutions that they can actually have your photo that processed and they can identify you very easily, and
Mm-hmm.
as if you don't have any regulation to protect or to allow you to be protected from that, it's very difficult to it would be very difficult to for you, you know, like because otherwise you can be I don't know, labeled as a threat, but like
Yeah.
because of bias, I don't know what can happen, you know. So then if there is such a threat, I believe like there is this kind of level of threat nowadays. Of course, there is other threats, but then I think like what could affect us directly as the kind of threat that where your data is scrapped and then you're going to be using and in a non-ethical way, and it can cause you harm
Mm-hmm.
as well. So it's very important to brought this into society to discuss. I think that's important. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
at least a little bit.
I agree.
Yeah. So, um, do you think now, for now on in the future, do you believe the company is going to be moving more and more and more for this more like a security approach, or do you believe they're going to be more on the speed fast, like code first, break things, and then figure out later?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. I think what's the way to say it? Like, I think there's a sense that the there's been a sea change in how AI is perceived, right? And probably how tech is perceived, really.
Yeah.
Like, I think there's a better understanding now of how technology and analytics and AI are influencing our lives than there was 10 years ago. Even though, like I said, I don't think the average person has the tools that they need to get the best from the technology that they use or to have proper choice. I think there's a general awareness that these tools are there and that they're influencing the way that we live. And
Mhm.
I think that's probably going to increase that level of awareness and that level of concern. Like I was looking at a study from Pew Research that found that of Americans are more afraid of AI than they are enthusiastic about it.
Oh,
Um,
really?
So there's this kind of thing, I think, where people are aware now in a way that they weren't 10 years ago. And that ultimately means that companies are going to have to react to that.
Mm.
Right. I think this like move fast and break things mentality, I don't think it's going to be as viable, um, going forward, because consumers are just going to have higher standards. And I think you can see that in like the generational difference between, like, I'm 34, people who are coming behind me or say 17, they're far more savvy in terms of social media than I ever was, right? Like they'll
Mm.
understand what sharing a photo means in a certain context, how better to protect their data, and so on. Because they've lived in it their entire lives, so their level of understanding is going to be better, and that's going to push companies to change, at least to some extent. So my sense is like, first of all, consumers will push businesses into safer and more responsible behavior. And also, generally, I think businesses just know more now about the ethical potential risks in AI, right? Where in the beginning, there, I mean, it sounds strange to say, but like in the beginning, I guess this that the focus might have been more on just, I guess, accuracy or performance or whatever it
Mm-hmm.
was. And it's not because people didn't care about causing harm then. Of course they did. But the way in which it could cause harm wasn't fully understood. Like, if we think about, say, the Amazon tool that we spoke about before, they didn't include gender explicitly in there, right? The tool picked it up by itself.
Mm.
And there are so many examples of AI harm that come in that way, where even though you put safeguards in, it turns out that there's some statistical quirk that causes bias to happen anyway. And that's quite common. And I think it's difficult to know that unless you've seen it, right? So in the earlier stages, I think companies, even though they would have tried to put the proper safeguards in, didn't have a full understanding of what they should even be looking for. I think it's different now, where we've got a a long like list of cases where it's gone wrong, but also a lot of prominent ethicists in the field now, right? Like people like Ruman Chowdhury or Timnit Gebru and people like this, who have made their entire life's work out of
Mm.
ensuring that AI is built responsibly. They build companies on this basis. They publish papers on this basis. They go on talks on this basis. There's just a lot more knowledge and understanding of the concerns and what we can do about them. So my sense is that like companies will always want to move as fast as they can, because that's just the nature of a business. But they're better equipped now.
Right. Perfect. Perfect, man. Well, that was a good one. All right. I don't have much questions right now, but I do have actually. I
Mm,
always like to put up like a philosophical question when
sure.
I approach the end. But this time I
Sure.
ask ChatGPT to do for me because we're talking about AI. And
Sure.
there's one that they put here that's about Hannah Arendt, because she used on her works. He has a book called the Human Condition, where she distinguished the difference between labor, which she saw like there was this kind of like repetitive and never ending task, and work
Mm,
that actually create a lasting impact on your life. And so
mm.
nowadays AI, the machines can perform both labor and work. So
Right.
do you think this distinction that Hannah made in the past now it holds up today?
Mm. Yeah, it's a really interesting question. Yeah. It makes me think of I read an article last week, I think, about how ChatGPT and applications like it, some preachers are using them to help write sermons, right? So like to reference certain scripture, or to just come up with to teach their congregations, right? And there's a debate about um, whether they should do it, but also how meaningful it is, right? So you have some preachers come in and say, look, you the the value of what you're projecting out, right? What you're saying, what you're speaking about, is in whether you actually wrote it, right? If you're going to lead a congregation of people and you're asking them to follow you in whatever faith it is, then a key part of that is that whatever you put out to them, that actually comes from you, right? It didn't come from some machine. So the like the quality isn't even necessarily the point, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
whether that emotional feeling is there. Now, different people are going to draw their own lines on that, I think, but I think the distinction does exist still, and it's honestly one that I think the distinction will still be there, but the definition will change, right?
Mm-hmm.
What people have been saying about ChatGPT and AI in general is that it's not people feel like it's not going to eliminate jobs generally, that it's going to like there's going to be a net positive creation of jobs, right? So some jobs might go away, but they'll be replaced by other better ones. And like as an aside, I'm not entirely convinced by that line, right? Where
Mm-hmm.
first of all, it's not necessarily possible for a person who loses their job to just move into something else, right? Like if you're in your 50s, say, and your job gets eliminated, you can't just retrain to be an AI engineer or something like that. That just can't happen. And there is research to show that the integration of technology has had a depressing effect on wages in certain sectors, right? So I think that's a kind of a fraught question in itself. Um, but if we look at it that way and we say that, like, now that we have ChatGPT, there's certain things that you might not do anymore that you did, right? So, like, one thing people have talked about is if you wanted to do research on a topic before ChatGPT, you might have to go to Google or Gartner or some
Mm-hmm.
uh, other like university or whatever it is. You pull all the sources yourself and bring it all together. Whereas now, in theory, you could use ChatGPT to do that, right? Where you could say, like, I'm studying this topic, give me a list of resources. You should always check it, obviously, because it does sometimes make things up, but it would give you a good starting point there. And then you could have more time to convert that into something
Mm-hmm.
meaningful. And that might be a blog post, it might be whatever podcast that you're doing, it might be a talk at a meetup or something. But you have more time to work on that bit than you would have before when you had to do all the research, right? So if we think about it then, like before ChatGPT, that stuff that you that is closer to work, right? Because it's fundamental to what you're trying to do to create the content. Whereas with ChatGPT, now it's like, no, that's labor, right? That's just a thing that I need to do to get to where I want to be, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of how I would think about that. I think is that the distinction will still be there because people will always want to do things that are actually enriching their lives, and that are making them feel good, that are making them feel like they're contributing in the way that they want, that are stimulating them in the way that they want to like think about the world and all of that. The integration of tools like AI and ChatGPT, I think, will just change what we think of as meaningful work and what we think of as just more boring kind of rote stuff.
All right, man. That's very profound. That was really good.
Sure.
Really cool, man. Listen, thank you for your time, man. I think it was perfect and was really cool. I think that you provide a lot of insights, and for me, it was very interesting. And I'm more like you as well. I believe like AI not gonna end up work just yet. And I feel like, for example, I'm as a software engineer, I know that my work as a software engineer is not gonna be the same. So like
Right.
because the way that I work 15 years ago, I work different now, and I'm gonna work different in the
Right.
future, and not gonna
Yeah.
maybe not gonna even have software engineers in the future. So I don't know.
Mm.
Hopefully not until I retired.
Yeah. I mean, like, what I think is interesting about that, right? When I said earlier that, like, whenever I thought about AI development, the hardest part was not the writing or the building of the model. Like, it was
Hmm.
actually the person to person understanding bit. When I think about like things like ChatGPT and all of that, like if they made writing code easier, right? If they made it quicker, I think that would ultimately be good, right? In the sense that, like, we would have more time then to think about like, or to work more closely with, say, UX researchers to
Mm-hmm.
understand how people are using our tools, right? Or to interact with customers more, to get a better sense for like what they actually want. So like,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what it's going to look like in the future, but my sense is that like, if the coding piece, right, if that were made more streamlined, like that's going to free us up to do a lot
Mm-hmm.
of other cool, interesting stuff.
Yeah, I do agree with that. Yeah, I think that it's very it's very interesting, important to see like how this helped a lot entire industry, and actually
Mm.
it's provide actually a steady, fast way to deploy features, deploy products, and then you can actually build more companies and try to generate more value, to add more value to society as like as a product wise part. So I think like that's pretty amazing what I have done. So for me, for example, I don't use ChatGPT on my work, but I use, for example, GitHub Copilot. I use Codino that
Right.
actually is integrated into my coding environment. So those tools is the same as like ChatGPT. They're generative. They help you out of
Mm.
the stuff and make you help you to do like tedious job. For example, unit tests. I hate unit tests, and then now AI
Yeah.
does for me.
Yeah. And that's it. Like, I think that's great. Like that kind of usage where, and it goes again, I think back to like the labor work
Yeah,
situation or question, right? Where that stuff, it's pretty standardized the way that you would do it. So if the tool can do it for you, yeah.
exactly. Hey man, thank you very much. Do you have any question?
Thank you. Um, so I'm curious. You're saying you work. Do you work in ML currently? Is that a part of your role?
Yeah, I do have a company that does work with machine learning and AI. We do
Mm.
models to work on processing curriculums as well, but we work
Okay.
on text based. So that's why on our side, like we always trying to look at bias, and our bias is a the problem with bias is different than gender and personality. The
Mm.
problem with bias is more like job experience
That's it.
and skills. That's a big problem. And then we're trying to delve into that and trying to bring the best version of our models every time that we develop. Actually, I say me, I do this all the time. And and on my current work now, because this is a startup, I do it as a side hustle, I'd say. And on my
Mm.
own current company, I actually starting off as well to work with developing a model there to try to represent the best, to bring up the best search for with consumers. And
Mm.
but then we are in early stages now. We still in the phase of treating data and cleaning up the data.
Yeah, I mean, I think like that's always 60 or 70% of the problem in
Yeah,
building
exactly.
these models. It's just like getting the data in the right shape. I think it's a shame because like they don't really tell you that in courses usually. Like
Mm,
if you go in and do a machine learning course, they'll very rarely explain just how difficult
yeah.
data manipulation is. I think it's always a shock then when you get out and you start actually using real world data and you see how messy it is.
It's true. And for me, it was like I learn on the like hard way, like just like
Mm.
through in code and trying to figure out how the
Sure.
data works. And then later I was like, oh, there is this thing called notebook. I can just do my explorations here.
Right.
It was funny. But yeah, I learn most by myself. I don't have like I don't have a master's or anything. I learned
Mhm.
by studying the coding itself.
It's cool.
Oh, man. All right. So Angus, do you want to leave like the way that people can connect to you, the people can like find you elsewhere in the internet?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the main way would probably be my LinkedIn. I am on Twitter, but I'm very bad at like regularly checking it, so I'm not really on there that much. I think that would probably be the main way is the LinkedIn.
All right. Cool. Cool, man. All right. Perfect. I thank you very much. I'm gonna stop
Well, thank
here
you.
the